Looking ahead, challenges and opportunities in the changing world. Welcome to Talking Economics, a podcast by the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute. In this episode of Talking Economics, we sit down with CERGE-EI alumnus Lukáš Makovský to explore the field of urban economics. He shares insight on the central questions and tools of urban economics, how models incorporate people's preferences, and examines the movement toward urbanization alongside the impacts of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Lukáš obtained his PhD in economic geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and now works as a lecturer of real estate at Henley Business School, University of Reading, UK. Welcome, Lukáš.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Lukáš, you work in a very interesting field, which I think to some extent is still not well known, at least in some areas. So can you maybe start with an introduction? What are the main questions of urban economics? What is this field dealing with?
Yeah, I think this evolved a little bit over time because it all started with questions about why and how do we observe some patterns in cities? For instance, like why cities are denser in their city centers, then why the density do decline towards the edges of cities, why do people commute, why property prices are lower at outskirts, why they are higher in the city center. Well, all these questions started, let's say, in 1960s, 1970s, and there was a lot of theoretical literature writing on that. So urban economics really started as a theoretical field because for a long time, economists did not really have a sufficiently detailed local data. So if there were data from, let's say, national statistical offices, they were either aggregated on county levels or metropolitan statistical area level. So there were not really good data on sufficiently local level. Well, this has changed, let's say, starting mostly in 90s, when data on a much more spatially granular level started to be available. And there was a new wave of research that tried to review all the theories and look at the theories through lenses of available data. And actually, that was really the time when a lot of these older theoretical papers, and I'm not saying that there were no empirical papers, but theory was really much more common. But let's say starting in 90s, urban economics has turned into it has become much more applied branch of economics. So currently, empirical work is much more common in urban economics.
So speaking about the tools that are prevalent in the field, are there some specific tools that you would emphasize?
No, I think it's as in other applied microeconomics research. So I think in terms of methods, we actually do share the same methods, and usually the difference could be that we do put more of emphasis on the spatial dimension of data. So we might be investigating differences at some strange policy-induced boundaries and things like that. So I would say the methods don't differ that much.
You gave us a nice overview of how the field changed from its beginnings, mainly switching from theoretical to empirical. What about the questions? I suppose the questions changed as well.
Yeah, I think in that respect, it also followed a little bit of data availability because initially the first theoretical questions were like, let's say, when we are now looking at it as urban economics history, some 50 or more years ago, the questions were really about structure of cities, what I mentioned, the densities, how do they change, what are property prices. These were some questions that were investigated theoretically. But as the field evolved, the question got, got more detailed. And if I would go to, let's say, contemporary times, there were always a question, for instance, what motivates existence of cities? So it's it's in a way not straightforward. Why should we see existence of cities? Because cities are in a way expensive. Land values are higher in cities, so we have to pay higher cost of housings. Commuting is more expensive, so we on average commute longer in cities. So there has to be something that actually motivates people to be in cities. And one of the reasons is that cities are more productive. With increasing city size, productivity goes up. So the force that's offsetting these higher costs is higher productivity that get capitalized into higher wages. So people are attracted to cities because they can earn higher wages. And this evidence, or like even if you look into data, this has been documented for decades, going back to 70s. But with availability of individual level data, and especially population panels that track individual workers over decades, we can now answer much more refined questions like, do these agglomeration economies affect all workers the same way? Or let's say, are more skilled workers benefiting more in their wages from locating in larger cities? Or is it the way that once you enter a city, your productivity immediately goes up? Or is the city more like a place where you learn over time, and in the larger place you are, the more you learn, and then over time your wage goes up? And well, these all questions, there are already papers looking at these, and these could be papers published in late 2010s or maybe even recent ones. So it shows that this is really still like a very active area of urban economics. Another, I would say, quite active research area in urban economics that I'm particularly interested in are effects of planning regulation on cities. So if policymakers, if planners make cities more constrained, if building new housing is more difficult, costly, how does it affect economic performance of cities? How it might affect people by their skills or by their income differently? So there is actually a lot of these new questions that are now quite widely researched in urban econ.
You sound, it depends on the availability of data. I know that your research is quite focused on the Czech Republic. So what is the situation with the data in the Czech Republic, and how are you able to answer these questions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because data availability in the Czech Republic is an issue. So it was part of my dissertation actually to try to look at some of these issues that have been already documented in countries where we do have a good data, like good data are available in France, in the UK, of course in the US. Most of the research starts in the US where data on really high quality, although there are also some limitations, especially in the area of planning regulation, because it's a municipal or local authority area of, let's say, decision making. There are not really data, or until for a long time there were no data about planning regulation on a US level. So especially in the area of planning regulation, US might not be a good example, but otherwise pretty much all other types of data are available in the US, as I said, in the UK, France, or Germany. So Czech Republic is a country where these type of data that are used elsewhere are usually missing. So one, let's say, one area, or it was also about methodology that I employed in my dissertation, that I used rather recent methodology called quantitative spatial models. And these models allow in general equilibrium to model cities or whole countries with limited data availability. So these papers, let's say the really well-published papers, they usually look at some historical data, because historical data, even from countries like UK, are typically not available. If you go to 19th century, you don't really have data on small geographical areas. So these models are employed to overcome the problem of missing data. So I took a similar approach. And for instance, one of my papers, that is a chapter of my dissertation, is about agglomeration wage premium in the Czech Republic. So it's exactly this thing, how actually cities are more productive if they increase their density. And
I like the title of the paper, which says estimating the heterogeneous agglomeration economics without wages, which, yeah, it says it already in the title, right? Like, we don't have the data, but yet we are able to do it. So can you say more?
Yeah, that's because in some of these models, and these models are more theory-based, despite the fact that we do not observe wages, we observe other patterns of workers' behavior. And in this paper, I exploit data that record where do people live on very fine geographical detail. Let's say it's these are several urban blocks. So these units usually have hundreds of workers. So these are very tiny geographical units. And I know where do they live and where do they work. And from these commute flows reported on actually individual level, to explain it easily, let's imagine you know where a worker lives and you know how distant in time are various employment opportunities. And well, if we do observe that vast majority of workers from one residence are picking one particular place where to commute, there has to be some reason why most of them actually are commuting to that place. And that reason is higher wage. So the costly commute is always compensated by a higher wage. And well, if we observe all the commuters, we know where they live and we know where do they work. We can actually reconstruct from this data what are the mean wages that these workers can earn in their destinations, at their workplaces. So despite not being able to observe wages directly, we can use commuting patterns to infer what are the likely wages from the commuting data.
And how come you have access to the commuting data and this fine data?
Yeah, well, there are some of these data are publicly available. Actually, my draft version of the paper, it was originally a paper that I submitted as a coursework for one course at LSE, and it has turned out that it has some further potential, so I developed it then into proper paper. So for the draft version, I used publicly available data that were reported on a municipal level. So if you go to municipal level, you can actually get the data publicly from Czech Statistical Office. If you want to get individual level data, then you have to apply as a researcher and get it from the statistical office under, let's say, individually negotiated contract. But as a researcher, you can do that.
Interesting. I thought that there were some other sources of data, like information from the mobile phone uses.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's something that's being used quite often for these types of studies, especially in developing countries, where when like mobile phones are already quite widely used there. So it's a good data source. But well, I wanted to go a little bit beyond that, and the disadvantage of mobile phone data is that you don't know the demographics usually of the user. So you can create a model for a representative worker. But in that paper of heterogeneous agglomeration economies, I wanted to know a little bit more about the workers. So because these data are coming from census, I was able to look at low, medium, and high skilled separately and actually estimate agglomeration wage elasticity separately for the three education groups.
Interesting. I think what I've observed as an increase in the interest in urban topics is, especially in our areas, is the question of the quality of living for people, right? That people, it's more and more a question about the quality of living in the cities, and so there is a question about the urban development and various policies and regulations. So can you maybe speak more about how do you work with people's preferences in the field of urban economics, and maybe speak about your paper where you deal with the noise question?
Let's say preferences of people, how we look at them and how they are revealed in space. We can look at different data depending on what our question is or what the research project is. And one way how we can find something about people is, and that was the previous paper, we can look at what spatial choices then they make given their options. So let's say we might assume they live somewhere, and we look at one of the revealed choice is where they decide to work. So that's one thing. Or we can also think about migration. If people do migrate from one place to another, it's some kind of like a choice they make in space. So that's something from what we can learn something about their preferences. But if we look at housing and quality of life, I would say the most common method that is being used are so-called hedonic pricing methods. In these methods, we are usually using housing market to inform us a little bit about what people actually do value and what they don't value. So it's essentially a standard regression where I do take housing prices or price of a given sold or advertised apartment, and I regress it on many features that the apartment itself has, and then on some amenities that are bundled with their apartment. Because apartments are located in space. Once you buy a real estate property, it's located somewhere. So if you buy a property that is close to a park, you have more of an opportunity to enjoy that park. If a nearest park is 2 kilometers away, you're much less likely to go there because you would have to pay this cost of walking to that park. So these models actually can reveal a little bit how people are ordering or preferring different qualities, both of housing itself. You can find out how do they value one additional square meter of apartment. You can find out how do they value if the apartment is in better condition. But you can also find out how people are willing to pay more for apartment, let's say 200 meters closer to a metro station or closer to a park or to any other natural amenity like a river.
And so what about noise? What is your study about this aspect of quality?
That paper tried to look at if there are some interactions of public amenities. Because we might think that low noise is one type of amenity and provision of green space is another type of amenity. And my question was, and if these two somehow interact one with the other, because there is a abundant literature about both separately. There has been tons of studies investigating what is the effect of one additional decibel on property prices, or what is the effect of a increase in provision of green space, proximity to green space. Again, it's been area that has been widely investigated. But I found out that there is, or I think there are really no papers like the one I've written, that they would look at, do people value more green spaces that are noisy compared to green spaces that are relatively quiet? So methodology is rather simple. I really look at what is the amount of green spaces that are in reasonable proximity to apartments that I do have in my data set, and what is the amount of green space in which is relatively quiet, and what is the amount of green space that is relatively noisy, and actually how these two types contribute to value of real estate property. And I've really found that it's really the relatively quiet parks that do have a positive effect on property prices. So it's kind of like showing that my interests in urban economics are typically related to urban planning, because this might be a policy relevant issue for cities in the Czech Republic, where we might actually have provision of green space, but some of this green space might not be of high quality, might be actually its quality decreased by being in proximity to major arterials, thoroughfares. So maybe these places could be, without the loss of amenity, could be developed. And what we really should care about, and what we should try, is to keep green spaces quiet and protect them from excessive noise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Looking maybe more into the future, we know that people have been moving from rural to urban areas, and there are many causes and consequences of that. What is your prediction for the future? And there is the fourth industrial revolution coming, right? The increase in automation and artificial intelligence. So do you see this? What role do you think this is going to play?
Well, I would say two things about it, because first of all, there is already some evidence in research that the benefits of cities, the productivity benefits of cities, are increasing with human skills, with education. And as developed and developing countries are getting more educated over time, they accumulate more and more of human capital. This should contribute to further urbanization and let's say relocation to larger cities, because these cities, actually these people can benefit in their productivity more from larger cities. So I think maybe the urbanization process is not yet at the end. That's one thing. Another one is to think about what are gonna be the requirements of future firms in terms of their capital and labor. Because if we are thinking of fourth industrial revolution as making production capital intensive without heavy reliance on labor, then there is a question like what share of production actually has to be linked to places where people do live. So maybe we'll see much more of a separation of these production from urban areas, because if urban areas are something that are expansive, they are defined by expansive land. So let's say if a manufacturing in the future is capital and land intensive, it needs a lot of these inputs, but it does not need labor, and labor is in cities. There is no reason why these manufacturing plants cannot relocate much farther away from cities, and we would just see places of production that have really thin population are just connected with cities because they just transport the final product. So maybe it's possible that we will see really cities as places of white collar employment and not really as places of physical production that could be done automatically in places that do have cheap land and don't require much of people to operate future firms.
My last question is more about your background, because you worked in a public planning office and so had the first-hand experience with the planning of a city of Prague, right? So and then you moved to academic world and you do research in urban economics. So what would you say about this journey? Was it helpful to have the experience, and is it still informing your research at this point?
I would say yes, in several dimensions. The first one is that being originally an urban planner gives me research ideas that I might not have otherwise. my job market paper is about effects of planning regulation on labor misallocation and migration. And actually, I think I wouldn't be able to write that paper without my actual background in urbanism. So I think it helps me to identify research topics, and so that's one thing. Another that maybe won't be that useful in a longer term horizon, but it was quite useful for me during my PhD studies, was that I had my research ideas for my papers in mind, but at the same time I was already quite familiar with the data that I can use, because I've been working with these urban data for years when being a planner. So actually it wasn't that difficult for me to orient in the data availability, and already I processed a lot of data in my past. So actually going from identifying research question, then actually working on the research project itself, it wasn't that difficult, and especially when it comes to identifying data and preparing them for my research purposes.
Excellent. Thank you, Lukáš. I think we are out of time. This was very interesting, so I'd like to thank you for coming here and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.